Pilots/flight crews of Reddit, what went wrong on your flight that the passengers never knew about? As a kid, 8 to 9, I flew in a small plane with my Air Force dad and his friend. We lived in Minot, big base there, and were flying sometime in winter. Later I learned we had such a long joy flight that day because the landing gear froze up and we were flying around trying to get them to come down. As we were almost out of fuel, they were planning to crash land on the frozen river. When in the nick of time the landing gear unfroze and deployed. I had no idea though. It was beautiful flying above a winter wonderland. Shit breaks all the time. Normally nothing so bad that the plane is gonna crash, but important enough that we take some sort of corrective action. The systems in planes, I fly a corporate jet, are so redundant and interconnected that you don't always know for sure what's actually broke. Example, you might get a message saying that your ground spoilers failed, but you can look back and see that they're working just fine. Turns out it's just a sensor gone bad. But do you think I flew the plane again until that sensor got fixed? Hell no. So to answer the question, they almost never know. I was flying a Pipe and a Vajo that seats 8 passengers out of a small airport. We were making all of our required radio calls, but because this was a small uncontrolled airport, some people in small airplanes will operate without radios or just don't care enough to broadcast their position. Anyway, we were doing our due diligence, but not long after takeoff, and while leaving the traffic pattern, my FO says shit and takes control from me and make a relatively aggressive, for passengers at least, turn to the right. As he does this, I see a Cessna route my left window no more than 150 feet below us. We essentially climbed through the altitude he was cruising at and turned to avoid him. Only one passenger noticed when we got to the destination, and he told us it was a good move. Good times. Not me but my father. Years ago when dad was flying the 767 for Air Canada, they were coming out of London Heathrow back to Canada in the winter time and some snow had started to fall. Heathrow 10 years ago was notorious for letting a dusting of snow hamper operations. Dad and crew expedited boarding and pre-flight as much as they could and pulled the brakes and pushed back early to get ahead in the queue for takeoff. They couldn't get a taxi clearance right away as a number of aircraft ahead of them had opted to wait for the heaviest of the snow to pass prior to taking off, and the controllers wouldn't move them out of the way. Dad basically begged them to move them ahead somehow, as he had been around the block a time or two and knew what was coming, but to avail. Ground had them park the airplane, and they sat loaded at the gate for 4 hours before all flights out were cancelled. Over 4 inches of snow. The airport's inability to deal with the snow and backlog of traffic meant that Air Canada couldn't get a plane out for 3 more days, by which time they had brought extra aircraft over from Montreal to try to relieve some of the build-up. So in this story, what the passengers didn't know is that if they were maybe 10 minutes faster boarding the plane, they wouldn't have gotten stuck in London for an extra 3 days. It was a flight from Kansas to Oregon, and as we were mid-flight, a hawk fucking dive-bombed the wing and entered it. The pilot announced the subtle thud as minor turbulence, but the crew knew what had happened. No one knew how the hell the hawk was flying so high. It was a smaller plane, so we only had 1.5 dozen people, not counting us crew members. The dent didn't actually mess with flight too much, but it's a hell of a story to tell. I used to do contractor maintenance work on aircraft, and once a bunch of us were returning from a job in Germany. The plane was a scheduled flight on a small, 50-seat or so, turboprop aircraft, and it was a bumpy flight. I'm fairly well traveled, and working on aircraft made me more confident than most of flying, but the turbulence started to get so bad that I was getting nervous. Nobody except the flight crew were allowed to unfasten their seat belts, and even they were being thrown about as they tried to move around. It was by far the worst flight I have been on. So anyway, just as things were getting to the peak of shittiness, one of the stewardesses made her way to one of my colleagues sitting across the aisle and said, in a hushed tone, "Excuse me sir, is it true that you guys are aircraft engineers? We have a slight problem out the back, and thought you might be able to help." I honestly thought we were going to die. that the bumpiness was not down to turbulence, but some flight system had gone AWOL. I didn't know what the fuck any of us would be able to do on unfamiliar equipment with no documentation, no spares and no tools, but sure enough my colleague went off with the stewardess and disappeared through the door out of the cabin. 10 minutes late he was back, and of course we were keen to know what the problem was, and if he was able to do anything about it. The problem turned out to be a ratchet strap on one of the cupboard doors in the galley was jammed so they couldn't get the snacks out. The flight continued to be horrible, and the snacks were predictably shit. As a child, my family and I spent a few days in the Bahamas, and as we were at the outdoor airport / single runway we discovered that we were flying an 8-seater single prop plane back to Florida. The first time taxiing down the runway, the pilots discovered something was wrong with the engine, so they pulled off to the side and made us sit next to the plane as they attempted to fix the engine. After being told that the plane was functioning again, we boarded and began to taxi down the runway again. I was watching the pilot and co-pilot do their thing when I noticed the airspeed indicator drop to 0 as we were about to lift off. At this point we were running out of runway and I watched as the co-pilot jabbed an on-working gauge with his palm and the gauge began to work again. The pilots then looked at each other, back at us, then back at each other before laughing. I was giving my sister and a friend a tour of the Chicago skyline over Lake Michigan. We are all having a good time. Suddenly, the engine goes quiet. A nightmare, especially because I only have one of them. The silence was noticeable and my sister looks at me and starts to panic. The engine comes back within about 3 seconds alive and well, and I head for the nearest airport. In a small propeller plane, it is hard to hide the silence of the engine. But since it came back, I acted like nothing happened. I don't think they realize how critical of a situation it almost was. I'm a bush pilot in Canada. I was working the right seat of a turbo otter, my first ever flight in one, so I was still getting used to the setup. We were taking off from a short strip in the middle of nowhere with 6 drillers in the back and a bunch of gear. Captain started the engine as I was just finishing up the passenger briefing. He started rolling down the runway as I was just getting seated. I thought he was just positioning the plane to prepare for takeoff, but then he gave it full throttle. I didn't even have my seatbelt or headset on yet. I'm focusing on getting this stuff on when I realize something isn't right. Getting closer to the end of the strip, Captain starts to panic as we aren't getting airborne. His hands were shaking like mad, and he kept reaching for things, but he couldn't figure out what was wrong. I think he was too busy looking at the trees and creek right ahead of us. I realized the problem. He was in such a rush to leave that he didn't do a pre-takeoff check. Propeller was still in full course, feathered on shutdown. It should have been full fine for takeoff. I yelled / gestured to him the problem and immediately pushed the prop forward. Engine had a huge surge and we just barely cleared the trees at the end of the strip. He acted like nothing happened for the rest of the flight. We didn't even speak a single word to each other. I suspect none of the passengers even realized what had happened and how close we were to being another statistic. When we got back to the airport I told him I was leaving, pack my bags, and never looked back. Dad's a pilot, so I get to hear all of these. Good one that comes to mind you, he flies 737s for a major airline. Getting ready to take off at night, he sees a plane about to land on the taxiway he's waiting on. He immediately just starts turning on every exterior light on the plane. Other plane pulled out of final descent at like 500 feet. Edit, just talked to him on the phone about it. He said it was back when he was flying the 727, so about 15 years ago now. He remembers seeing the plane coming down, and the captain was looking back over his shoulder at another plane. So my dad starts throwing on all of the lights, at which point the captain turns around and starts asking him what he's doing, and sees the plane, and then both of them literally just duck and wait for something to happen. And after a couple of seconds, when it's clear the plane wasn't going to hit, they both sit up. And my dad starts trying to call the tower. The tower is just not responding at all for a bit, and then a lady comes on. The dispatcher had been a man, and basically says, when you get to your destination, call this number. And the dispatcher and the pilot of the other plane both lost their licenses. Not a pilot, but used to do work on one's house. My favorite story was the time the heater went out in the cockpit, but not in the rest of the plane. So the pilot and crew are up there freezing, putting all their clothes on trying to warm up. Instruments and whatnot are freezing up. They had no idea if they were going to be able to land.